Awesome. Well, thanks everyone again for joining. This is being recorded, and we will share this afterwards, and also likely post it on our YouTube channel. And so obviously, we want to share it as far and wide as possible. My name is Josh Nicholson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Scite. Today, we're going to be talking about Scite in general, but more specifically about Assistant and how we're interacting with large language models and generally, how that has been built. And so on this webinar with me is Dom, our head of AI, who is leading that effort and has done most of the building of Assistant. And so I will do a brief overview, about 10 minutes or so, walking through kind of what Scite is, what is the history of Scite. And then when we get to the point of discussing about Assistant, I'll turn it over to Dom. And Dom's talk will be technical in nature because we want to kind of open up the inner workings of how we've built Assistant so you can better understand it and ultimately better trust it. So if you do have questions, please put it in the Q&A. We will try to answer those live in the chat at the end. And if you have any other feedback, you can also reach us directly. My email's on the screen, and I think Dom's email will be on the screen in his presentation. And then we're also available at hi@scite.ai and through our help bubble on the site. And so I like to show these slides, and I've shown them for a few years now, just to kind of remind us that, as hard as it is to do research, to publish, to find all these things, it's also amazing, right? Research has given us the ability to have these large virtual conferences. It's given us life-saving drugs. It's given us, better understanding of social structures and policies. All these things are ultimately informed and driven by research. And we think that's quite amazing. And so we're all very mission driven, trying to improve research so that, we can have a better world. With that said, there are challenges, right? There's a lot of research. In PubMed alone, which is just biomedical literature, there's about 2 papers coming out per minute. This is likely an underestimate at this point because this estimate was published a few years ago. And so it's hard to keep up with all of this, right? And related to that, how do we know what to trust, right? There has been growing concerns around reproducibility in social sciences and machine learning, psychology, and cancer research. And so what can we trust? What can we build upon? And how do we navigate these millions of articles that are being published per year? And so we built Scite to really kind of address these things, to try and make research more reliable, to make it a bit more understandable. And so increasingly research is becoming more interdisciplinary. And so it's hard to keep up with it. And it's also hard to synthesize it if you're looking at so many different disciplines. And ultimately, we've introduced Scite, as the name suggests, to introduce the next generation of citations. So moving beyond just kind of simple counts and lists of citations, really towards a more contextual view and nuanced view of citations. And so I will quickly kind of make sure we're all on the same page around what is Scite and what is the core aspect of Scite, and then walk through a little bit of those use cases, and then hand it over to Dom, where we can talk a bit more about Assistant, which I think a lot of people on this call are probably using most. And so the way that I like to show Scite is to show the world as it exists without Scite. And so this is actually my study coming out of my PhD. When you first look at this research article, you're naturally going to look at where is it published, what is the topic, who are the authors, what are their affiliations, and then some metrics, right? And we make judgment calls when we do these things. Is it in a journal that I know and trust? Do I know these researchers? Do they have a good reputation? Similar questions with the affiliations. And then for metrics, is it highly cited? Does it have a high altmetric score? Does it have a lot of views? All these different things are kind of little indicators or heuristics that we'll use to assess if we want to read this paper, if we want to cite this paper, and if we kind of trust this paper. And so in today's world, I would say the metrics are pretty superficial. High is better than low. More is seen as a more trustworthy or more impactful. And so traditional citation indices like Scopus or Web of Science will generally show you similar citation indices or lists. And so here is what it looks like through Scopus. There are 66 documents citing my work, but why are they citing, right? In order to see this information, you would have to open 66 different documents to see if the first paper presents supporting evidence to me, the second paper challenges me, the third paper cites me in the methods section, the fourth paper cites me 5 times throughout. And that is just a lot of work, right? That's hours of work just to see how one article has been cited. And so no one's opening up every single citation on every single paper they read just because it's simply too impractical. And so we're forced to reduce all this very valuable, really relevant information into a single number, right? And again, high is good, low is not so good. And so we want to make that information more digestible so that you can better contextualize how does this finding fit within the landscape of research? Has there been supporting evidence to the claim? Have people challenged this? Should I cite this? How do other people interpret this? Are there differences in the protocols or the methods? All these different things are contained within these relationships. They're just kind of buried there. And so a cite, similar to traditional citation indices, we do show a list of citing articles, but then unique to cite, we go into the full text of the citing article and then extract out the in-text citation statements. And so here is a paper that's cited mine. It was published 3 years after my work. And you can see it makes a citation to my work in its results section. So it's a results section citation. And then you can simply read the sentence that they use, right? So it says, in agreement with previous work, cites my study, the trisomic clone showed similar aberrations, albeit to a lesser extent, supplemental figure S2B. And so this way of looking at the citation context of these three sentences, the target citation sentence, the one before it and the one after it, the place where we grab that context, and then the classification as to whether it presents supporting evidence or contrasting evidence is really kind of the atomic unit of cite, the main unit of cite. And so we spent a lot of time partnering with publishers, getting access to articles that are otherwise not open so that we can build out this tool. And so it's been 5 years, many relationships formed, and really this is actually almost out of date because we're now at 1.3 billion citation statements extracted from millions and millions of scientific articles. And so that gives us a very comprehensive database that allows us to utilize this information. So you can look at reports, you can look at people, and as we'll see with Assistant, you can also look at this with large language models. So how do we do that once we get the full text? And so there is a lot of technical issues that go into just extracting out and displaying these three sentences. And so this is a visual representation of what that looks like. Most content is still in PDF format. And as we're all probably acutely aware, PDFs can come in 2 columns, single column. The in-text citations can be in parentheses, they can be brackets, they can be superscript numbers, parenthetical numbers. There are thousands of different formats to PDFs and reference styles. And so it's challenging to go into these millions of different articles and extract out this information. And we not only have to identify, that this is a reference, we have to make sure it's not mathematical notation or some other, form that you would likely see in scientific articles. Once you identify the in-text citation, you then have to take that little string of information and correctly match it to the reference section in the references. And again, references will vary in what they display. Some will have a DOI, some will have 2 authors, some will have an abbreviated journal name. We have to then take that information once we've reliably matched it and then match that against metadata from Crossref or DataCite. And so this is all just to get out this couple of sentences from the full text scholarly articles. And this is something that we spent years on really kind of developing this pipeline. And so the challenges of getting access and then the challenges of processing this articles so that we can start to classify the citation statements. And so we've actually published a paper that describes in detail how we built the system, the limitations, the tools we use. Many of these are open source tools and we contribute back to them. And we're really, proud to kind of show under the hood to build trust for the system. And so now our citation statements and towards that aim of being the next generation of citations are being displayed on the version of record. It's no longer just a concept or maybe we can do this. Smart citations or citation statements are live on millions of articles. And here is a representation of what it looks like on Wiley, on Royal Society, on the American Physiological Society, PNAS, and then increasingly in more and more places. And so as we kind of, make citations more useful in the research realm, the world has been taken by storm by large language models and ChatGPT, right? So ChatGPT is kind of everywhere. How is this going to impact my work? How is this going to impact my life? Do I use this? Do I avoid this? Is this the end of jobs? Is this the beginning of new jobs? There's a lot of uncertainties with large language models. They're very recent. And I would say, many people are kind of grappling with using them and how it will impact kind of their work. And so for research, ChatGPT can be amazing, right? You can ask a plain language question and get a response back that looks exceedingly, right. But is it, right? How do you trust it? Is this making it up? Is it something you can use for writing? Is it completely fabricated? And so, as pointed out in this tweet, and as pointed out by many people, there are challenges with large language models. They can make things up or these hallucinations. And so in many cases, ChatGPT or large language models need citations. And so we have been this small group of researchers focused on building the next generation of citations. And then comes this powerful tool like ChatGPT and all these other large language models. And what we're trying to do with Assistant is to really bring these things together, right? And so to bring the trust of peer-reviewed articles and to bring the power and flexibility of ChatGPT, so you can essentially, navigate the literature, understand it better, and also trust it, right? And I think that's a critical thing here, is that we're trying to build a system both from us doing this automated, but also from a UX perspective to better understand and better utilize research articles through a ChatGPT-like interface. And so this is Assistant, and Assistant is still in beta. And so we're actively collecting feedback and still, modifying things and making changes. And this has been used by hundreds of thousands of users across the world now at this point. And so the point of having this webinar is really to kind of open up the hood, right? How did we build Assistant? What are the limitations on it? And so that can help you better understand how to use it with your research. So I'm going to pass it over to Dom at this point, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about kind of the inner workings of how Assistant works. And again, we can take some questions from there.
Hi there. Can you see my slides here?
Yep.
I'm always got to confirm. Yeah, so like Josh said, yeah, feel free to ask questions in the QA. I saw some people raise hands, but we prefer that. And then, yeah, we'll take the questions at the end. So yeah, really, this is going to be a deep dive into how Site Assistant work. It will be technical, but hopefully not too technical. And we're going to go over every kind of piece and component of how Site Assistant works now, what we're kind of currently working on. So this is less of how to use Site Assistant, though maybe you'll sort of get its insights into that. There is a really good set of videos that Josh has recorded on our YouTube channel, which I posted a link to in the chat, that are more towards how you use Site Assistant. And so, yeah, just to recap, what is Site Assistant? It is an experience of using a large generative language model with a massive corpus of scholarly text. But you'll see that you can't simply do this. There needs to be a lot under the hood that goes on for ensuring that not only are we retrieving relevant sources to generate from, that they're credible, but we need to do things like fact checking and revision, and making sure the whole process is as transparent as possible to our users. And so one thing I want to emphasize is that while we're in beta, we really are looking for feedback. So if after this, you have feedback about how Site Assistant works, and you want to let us know, please let us know at hi@site, because we would really love to have your feedback. And a lot of the improvements we've made over the past few months have been driven by users like you, writing into us things like, this doesn't quite work in my discipline because I need meta-analysis and systematic reviews to be as recent as possible, things like this. So I'm going to go over kind of guiding principles that we use to build Site Assistant, but in particular, they're principles in general of building factual assistants, and how I'm going to go over this thing called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, I might call it sometimes, which is a very popular approach to grounding generative text in sources. However, there's many problems with RAG. So if you've used tools like Elicit or Perplexity, Bard or Bing, you've probably encountered a lot of these problems in retrieval augmentation that need fixing with something like fact-checking revision. And so after I kind of go over those principles, I'm gonna look at, how it works step by step. And so we recently released kind of this experience in Scite Assistant where you can see everything that happens as Assistant does its thing. But I'll kind of go under the hood for each of these. I think I might have skipped something. So like Josh was mentioning, these natural language generation assistants are very promising productivity tools, especially kind of in the scientific and research realm, where we can automate a lot of kind of more mundane tasks like summarization or rewriting or just crafting kind of bits of writing. But they do suffer from a hallucination problem or fabricated references. So yeah, if you've ever used ChatGPT, asked it for references, a lot of them won't be made up. And it's especially troublesome in scientific and research tasks where we need factually correct responses. So in some senses, especially if you're working in a biomedical or clinical field, there is something that's safety critical about using natural language generation in those fields. And so one of the things that really motivated us to build Scite Assistant was designed to solve this hallucination problem and enable safe natural language generation experiences for scientific and research tasks. And I'm going to share these slides, I think, as well. So if there are things that are kind of like too detailed and you want to look back on or references, you can kind of look at that. So retrieval augmented generation, things like Bing, Bard, Perplexity, Elicit, Scite Assistant included, they use something called retrieval augmented generation. Now, what that looks like is we're using a large language model. We use a set of different large generative language models that I'll go over in a minute. What we do is we have the task that you've defined as the user. This is simplified because it leaves out a lot of things like the instruction prompt and previous context, if it's sort of like a multi-turn conversation. But in its most basic form, what retrieval augmented generation does is we are prompting a large language model for natural language generation with the task given by the user. So the task could be a question, but it could also be something like a chunk of an essay where you want the Scite Assistant to rewrite that with citations, something like that. So we'll do a bunch of things, which I'll discuss later for retrieving these sources. But once we've retrieved the sources, then we append the references. So here is an example of appending 3 references. To one of those references has 2 different sections. And we append 3 references, and it has metadata about the paper, and information either from the full text or the abstract. And so by using that, then when the large language model is doing generation, it can cite those references. Okay, so that's all in what's called in-context retrieval augmented generation. There are other approaches to retrieval augmentation, like retro and other things that are more complicated, but this is kind of like a basic approach that lets you use publicly available large language models without modifying them or specifically fine-tuning them for generation. Now that I've introduced RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, I'll kind of go over I'll just kind of mention that it's been found in this Liu et al. Paper that RAG-based systems you often use irrelevant or inappropriate sources that do not support their claims. Okay, so just because a large language model is grounded in sources like this, it does not mean that they will use those sources appropriately. It does not mean that they will it won't prevent them from even fabricating references. So there are a lot of problems, and here's like a few retrieval augmented generation systems that suffer from this issue. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we do a number of different things. The two kind of big solutions that we have for retrieval, for fixing inappropriate citation problem and retrieval augmented generation, one is self-criticism. So it's been shown in the literature that models are generally able to fact check their own answers and provide revisions to get towards correct answer. We use a system for fact checking our own answers that removes inappropriate citations, revises the paper to be more factually consistent and factually correct and faithful with the results, and generally provides this experience of criticism or revision that ensures that the answers are fact-checked. So this allows us to ensure that each claim that's being cited, or each claim with a citation, is an appropriate citation. That's a relevant source. Now, the other thing that we do is these large language models that use retrieval augmented generation. One of the problems that causes them to have this issue, where was my slide? Causes them to have this issue with irrelevant or inappropriate sources is that if you select, sorry, my keys messed up there. Here we go. If you select sources that are inappropriate or irrelevant in the first place, so say you're doing a biomedical task and it gives you sources from physics or something like that, models generally want to cite the references that you have given it. So one thing that we do is this credibility analysis, using a lot of the infrastructure that we've already built with Scite in terms of supporting in criticizing, contrasting, disputing citations, is it allows us to understand the credibility of sources and allows us to ensure that retrieval augmentation selects credible and appropriate sources. Now, I did see that I kind of skipped over a slide, but I just wanted to emphasize that another thing that's unique for our retrieval augmented system on top of this factuality verification process and revision and credibility analysis is the fact that we have, as Josh mentioned, over 30 indexing agreements with academic publishers that allows us to use the full text of closed access sources. Okay, so unlike these systems like Cohere, Bard, Bing, Elicit, and Perplexity, they do not have access to closed access sources. We have access to closed access full text sources. And we primarily use the full text in addition to the abstract for crafting our answers. That's another difference, where other systems primarily use abstracts and titles. And then, yes, of course, Scite Assistant knows whether documents have been supported or disputed using a lot of the system that Josh had presented at the beginning. And so that's kind of like our guiding principles of how to build factual assistance, scientific research task assistance. Now, of course, it's not perfect. We're always gathering feedback from users, trying to work on the factuality problem. But in general, we find our system is quite good at improving the factuality of answers, removing irrelevant sources, and generally ensuring that the citations used are appropriate. So how does Scite Assistant work step by step? Well, there's a few general steps. Okay, so one is called tool use, or determining tools to use. We'll go over that in a second. It's basically picking parts of the Scite platform to use when you give it a task. The next is search strategy formulation. So a good example, or a good kind of analogy or illustration of what this is that if you've ever used a reference librarian, if you've ever gone to a reference librarian to help you formulate a search strategy in a literature database or something like this, to find the optimal search strategy to find the sources that you need for your research. That's what search strategy formulation does. It's an automated approach to creating the optimal search strategy to accomplish your task. Ranking and credibility analysis. These are the kinds of things that I mentioned, where even if you have a high, what's called recall set of sources, so you have a lot of sources that could potentially answer your question, there are going to be some sources that are irrelevant, some sources that are inappropriate, and that's oftentimes with the previous generation of retrieval augmented systems where they go wrong, is that they get these inappropriate, irrelevant sources. So we do a lot in terms of ranking, credibility analysis to ensure that the sources are the highest quality sources that are selected. Then we do retrieval augmented generation, which I talked about earlier. We do fact checking, and then and revision. And then the big part of our system that we really try to put forward and are constantly trying to solicit feedback from our users is around transparency of the whole process and why Scite Assistant made the decisions it did, and so on. Okay, so the first step that you'll generally see in Assistant now that it shows its steps is determining tool use. Okay, so when you give it a task, like how does the structure of a protein affect its function? So this is a question. There's a bunch of different tools within Scite that could be used. They could be Scite search or dashboards or reports or none of the above. Essentially, what we need to decide when you give it a task is what parts of the Scite platform do we need to use to retrieve the sources to answer your question. So dashboards, for instance, might be where you have a set of literature that you've been working on. It's a Zotero library that you've uploaded to Scite, and you want Scite Assistant just use those sources or something like that. So we use a tool decision procedure. It sounds more complicated than it is. Essentially, we're using large language models to select which tool to use. And again, it might be none of the above. You might just have a summarization task or a text simplification task that doesn't need additional sources, for instance. So after we've kind of determined the tools to use, we create a search strategy formulation. Again, I think a lot of these things sound more complicated than they actually are. So if you look just at the top right hand of my slides, or maybe left, depending on how you're looking at this, you see kind of this prompt that says, like, you're an expert reference librarian, your job is to create optimal search strategy. Essentially, what we're doing here is we're instructing the model to provide an optimal search strategy for a given task. So again, I'm using a lot of tasks that are question answering, but this could be summarization, text, and it could be, writing assistance, and other tasks like this. And so what we get from this prompt is we get a set of queries that we'll use in our tools. Okay, so, and you have some control over how those tools are used in the Scite Assistant settings. So there's a little gear icon in Scite Assistant on the bottom left that you can sort of open. And a lot of these settings, like journals, dashboards, publication types, reference topics, reference year range, these are things that will help you as a user guide how the searches are done. And if you've used, for a while now, we've been displaying what those searches were run. Okay, so you see the searches run down here on the bottom right-hand corner. And so those were the searches run that retrieve the sources that we'll use in retrieval augmented generation. So yeah, that's what it looks like, generating a search strategy based on your prompt. Now, once we've run all of those sources, we usually have a list of, between 90 and 200 sources, something like that. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to rank those sources, or in technical terminology, re-rank the sources, because already ranked from the outcome of a search engine. We use Elasticsearch. So we have this huge lexical search over this massive corpus of full text. And then we have the semantic search bit, which is using a cross encoder for determining relevance scores. We re-rank the sources based on a number of factors. So their relevancy from the cross encoder or the semantic search component. There are things like recency, citation count, supporting citations, or contrasting citations, which are the things that Josh showed in the beginning, the site-specific citation classifications, downweighting predatory journals, providing information about journal quality through the cite index, which I won't get into, but you can sort of search for that on our website. That just uses the supporting contrasting citations overall for a journal. And we use this information to basically rank our sources. You have control over ranking, so you can use the reference ranking setting to just exclusively use one of these for ranking, which is important because some of our users have different ranking needs. But this general default ranking setting is what we use for what we've crafted based on feedback from our users. So that's what's happening during this step of ranking 30 results to figure out your answer. And you can see the view publications consulted. Those publications consulted are the ones consulted for ranking. Okay, so now we get to the step of retrieval augmented generation. Now that we have these highly precise, credible, appropriate sources. We use a variety of different models for retrieval augmented generation, depending on the situation, from GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 to Claude Instant, Claude Next, sometimes Cohere or Azure's OpenAI model. Generally, we're using GPT 3.5. And GPT-4 is reserved for use cases for our enterprise clients, with a fallback to Claude Instant when the reliability of OpenAI is degraded in some manner. So that's kind of like the main set of models we use. We often get questions about like, can you use GPT-4? And I'm often saying, well, there isn't a lot of evidence that GPT-4 is actually that much better than GPT 3.5, especially in this kind of task. GPT 3.5 actually performs much better from our observations. So we do provide GPT-4. We'll provide it for enterprise clients if they must, but we recommend against it. And if you're interested, the reason why that is because GPT-4 is a mixture of 8 small models. And there's problems that occur in factuality, in particular, when you're mixing answers from different models. Despite the reports that GPT-4 had on its results in medical tests and so on. Anyway, so the retrieval augmented generation step, that's what's happening when you see this composing response based on X amount of results, and you can look at the publications that are being consulted while it's being generated. You can look at the searches run to ground the response and so on. And so what's happening now is we'll stream out the response, and that's retrieval augmented generation going on. And then we have fact checking. So again, what fact checking is, we used a bunch of different approaches to fact checking, but kind of settled on model self-evaluation as our fact checking and revision approach. So basically what we have here is an instruction prompt on how to fact check. So yeah, we're using simulation, which is a popular kind of model of using large language models. So we're simulating scientific editing process for scientific journals. And so these are kinds of the kind of things that we're looking for revision. So like removing, for instance, removing references that are not provided in the references section. That's some basic stuff, but also ensuring there's no factual errors, and the sources strictly match the evidence in the sources strictly match with the text. And that's what's happening during the step of the fact checking my answer to make sure it's correct. Finally, that's kind of like all of the technical bits. Finally, we have this experience of transparency and auditing. So essentially, we want users to know everything that Scite Assistant is doing. We want to be as transparent as possible. We have no problems in saying exactly how our system works, where there's limitations, and so on. Right now, based on user feedback, that consists of showing what searches were run, which publications were consulted during generation, which publications ended up actually being used after generation, and which part of each publication was used. So you can see here in this example, just if a user, this is a user task centered around VPS4A mutations. And so this is just highlighting a source. This is source reference number 5 here in this example, where we show the text that was used from the full text during generation. So essentially you can think of it as yourself as a researcher. When you cite another paper, you're using a particular claim in that paper, a particular set of text that you read when you're making a citation. And that's exactly how this works. And with our user interface, we try to make that as transparent as possible, showing which text was used. And so that's really, in a nutshell, like the long and short of how Scite Assistant currently works. Scite Assistant is still in beta, so you'll see these kind of like thumbs up and thumbs down icons. Please use them to give us either positive or negative feedback. We look at these and we use them to ensure that we're building like the best Scite Assistant experiences possible. Some of the kinds of things we're currently again, our roadmap's primarily driven by you. It's primarily driven by users writing in, asking us for particular things or saying where something's gone wrong. And some of these things are primary sources problems. So users have mentioned that Scite Assistant tends to use a lot of secondary sources like reviews and so on, or doesn't cite the original article. That's something I'm currently working on now, so we should release on Friday or early next week. Better auditing. So another thing that we're currently kind of mulling around is there's these auditing sort of frameworks like Prisma for systematic reviews that we can leverage to ensure like as transparent experience as possible. We've had lots of feedback on how do we upload our own material, say if it's a manuscript in progress. We haven't done any kind of formal evaluation of Scite Assistant. We're still kind of waiting for Scite Assistant to be out of beta in order for us to do that. But that'll be something that's coming soon. Essay length 8 answers. I threw this one agency, but now I'm like, ooh, do I want to explain that? But essentially it's giving Scite more kind of decision-making powers to use different tools as things are happening. So yes, again, feedback is welcome. Please email us at hi@scite.ai if you have any kind of feedback or ideas or anything. We really, that's really what drives the development of Scite Assistant. And again, as I mentioned, this is kind of like a technical talk. If you were looking for something of like, well, how do I use Scite Assistant? How do I craft prompts and so on? I would check out our YouTube channel. You can just search Scite at YouTube, and Josh has some pretty good videos on that. So I'm gonna look at the questions.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Dom. I've been answering very rapidly many questions.
Okay.
We've got a lot of them, and I think there's some that I've left kind of unanswered, either from me writing that maybe you can respond to. The first one, I think you cover kind of nicely on this last slide, which is how can I help site assistant development with my data and input? And so email, as we've said, and then next to each response, there's the ability to give feedback as if this is a good response or a bad response. And I think the more information you put there, right, the better.
Yeah, definitely.
The second one is a bit more technical. So it's on using GPT 3.5, 16K. I've tried Scite. It's quite impressive. What strategies do you use to make it so precise? And so you've talked a bit about this. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah. So all of the above. Yeah, all of these essentially. So I mean, yeah, we use something called a cross encoder. Let me go through these one by one. So the first kind of one of cosine similarity, or we use a approach called a cross encoder. So you don't need to produce embedding vectors in the cross encoder. What you're doing is you're taking the user task and you're taking the source and you produce a 0 to 1 kind of interval between 0 to 1. You produce a score based on similarity for each of these, and this forms our semantic search or a re-ranking in terms of relevancy. So we use that in addition to lexical relevance, which comes out of Elasticsearch. In terms of fine-tuning, yes, we fine-tune our re-ranker based on scientific literature, through retrieving scientific literature, and there's lots of publicly available data sets that we leverage for that. Context engineering, a lot of like the prompts that I showed are but maybe this isn't exactly what you meant by context engineering, but this is kind of like what I gathered. And then, yeah, custom function calls. I showed a very simple version of tool use where I don't show function calls, but yeah, we use function calls for that. So yeah, all of the above, really.
Awesome.
Okay, so the next question, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can take that one.
Yeah.
This is referring a bit more to kind of coverage. So to what extent have you integrated historical and social science journals into your platform? So we have social scientists on the team. We have agreements with Cambridge University Press, APA, Wiley, and so we are already integrated and including many social science publications, of course, including open access publications as well. And so we have a lot of that, and it goes back, in some cases, hundreds of years. And so we have an agreement with the Royal Society, and there are publications back to the 1600s, and you can find citation statements correctly extracted from articles that are 200 years old, which is pretty remarkable to look at those PDFs. And so we are certainly trying to be as comprehensive and cover all disciplines, even though many demos often rely upon, our backgrounds as researchers. So if Dom's talking, he'll tend to do more searches related to AI or machine learning, whereas, I have a background in cell biology, so I often give demonstrations on that. And so, yeah, thanks for that question and the feedback. The next question comes from Carol. Maybe these are two parts that you can take, Dom. How do you determine a search strategy is optimal, and can you include co-citation analysis in your ranking?
Yeah. Yep. So determining a search strategy is optimal. There's kind of like two bits to this. One is quite technical, and it actually has to do with something called simulation. That is a behavior of large language models. So essentially, under simulation, you have and again, this is quite technical, but it is really the only way to answer the question. You have a probability distribution that basically, from all of the text on the internet, allows you to simulate certain distributions of text. So one of those distributions of text is all kinds of ideas about search strategies. And so we leverage that probability distribution that allows us to have the model use its own internal model of optimal search strategies. That is what you would find from literature on optimal search strategies, essentially. So maybe I thought of maybe some way to really simplify this. It's that we're essentially jamming loads of textbooks of how to formulate search strategies into the model. And those textbooks are used to evaluate the search strategy.
And one thing that I can add beyond that is, so we are showing the searches there, and one point of feedback that we got wouldn't it be great if I could edit those searches, right? So you could say, I don't want this search, or I don't want this key term in there. And so that's something that we will soon release, where you see these search strategies developed and maybe you don't like one, or you disagree with one. We will give you the ability to edit that and to be more precise so that you can get better answers.
Yeah, that's something I think that is important. That will help us with like crafting search strategies, because again, this distributional simulation that allows us to use basically textbooks about optimal search strategies. It doesn't mean it's optimal for every situation. So there might be lots of situations you want to edit something. And then, the second thing that's really easy to answer, how do you determine the search strategy is optimal, is use quantitative evaluation, which I mentioned at the end. We haven't quite investigated, but actually Josh and I have been talking to someone who will probably get into a project of doing more of an information retrieval evaluation of our system. So that will help.
We are increasingly happy to work with researchers to test out these different things. And so we are engaged with various researchers in different disciplines that are already looking at kind of the usefulness or accuracy of other large language models like ChatGPT, and then also comparing them to Scite. And so we're very happy to kind of look deeper on this and to work and cooperate with researchers looking at this more generally.
Could you include co-citation analysis in your ranking? That's potentially something to look into. We are right now under development using citation chaining for solving the primary source problem, and it's working somewhat for that. And so it could be a strategy. The main limitation with co-citation analysis is that when you do like different types of like bibliographic measures, there's kind of this when you're using full text, there's this very large corpus you produce. And so it's fine if you're doing like one hop kind of backwards citation chaining, where you're going like, if I'm going to cite this reference, what did that reference cite, and so on. Your corpus is still kind of manageable for using these technologies for semantic search. But if you use co-citation analysis, like it gets quite computationally intensive, and it's probably not something we want to do. So that Scite assistant isn't take forever.
We can just go through the
so the fact-checking strategy is quite surprising. Have you done any validation work that's just prompting a large language model to be factual actually works? So there's a few parts to this question. One is that many people have done this evaluation, and yes, they've all been surprised. Large language models generally are very good at something called self-evaluation. So I've cited a few papers here that are recent. Shepard by Luc Sedelmoyer's group, the Constitutional AI by Anthropic's group, another one recent, FactLlama. They all use this kind of self-evaluation work. And again, like we haven't done any comprehensive evaluation of our system. So we'll be doing that in the near future, but there's loads of evidence now that this approach does work. Okay, so this question, is there a way to know if the claim that is being attributed to the article was the author's unique claim? Yes. Could it be a claim for which, this is, I'll read in full. Could it be the claim for which the authors themselves provided an in-text citation to an older article? In other words, is there a way to know that the correct article is being cited? This is a great question. So I didn't go too much detail of what I meant by the primary source problem. This is the primary source problem. And so in many ways, there is not a way to know if the claim is being attributed to an author's unique claim. In other words, if the author is the first person to do this. And there's many like kind of famous disputes in science in my discipline, one between Jürgen Schmidt-Huber and other kind of people in deep learning about a proper credit assignment. And it's just something not even scientists can do. However, if you do have the in-text citation to an older article, you can look through it, and that's exactly the system we're building right now. So, you can't know, but Cite Assistant will do the citation chaining of looking back at the references that were cited in text and cite those instead. So that you should look forward to that coming this week or next.
Well, I can maybe give you a break on some of these. Do we need to double check all the information pulled from each text once I cut a fact being cited with the wrong source? So we encourage you to check these things, and we try to make it very easy to check. And so, Assistant is never going to be perfect. And so it's wise to recognize the limitations of these things. And we do our best through all these complex systems that Dom has presented to minimize, the wrong sources or the wrong attribution and things like that. But from a UX and UI perspective, we also want it to be easy for a user to see this, right? And so when you see this generated output, you can see a real reference. You can see how that reference has been cited. Has it been supported? Has it been challenged? You can also see exactly the context that we're matching against, right? So here's what the machine wrote. Here's what the human wrote. Is that actually right? Right? And so I think it's always important to kind of still, think critically about this and not just blindly ask a question, copy everything, and then submit it as homework or submit it as a paper. And so it's certainly good to check, and we want to make it easy for you to do so. The next one, can the character limit of the essays be increased? This comes up for a few of them, and so maybe you want to talk a little bit about
we don't have any character limit or anything like that. So you shouldn't run into this.
Well, we do have like a context limit, right? Like
we do have a context limit of depending on the model. So generally, if it's GPT 3.5, that's being used of 16,000 tokens. And so for that, we use like a truncation strategy. But yeah, we're generally limited to the truncation strategy, which is essentially like pulling the most relevant bits that would fit into 16,000 tokens. And sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say on settings. So Assistant has a settings feature, which I think there's been a lot of questions. Maybe this is a bit hidden. You can choose shorter, medium length, or longer answers.
Yeah.
And generally these are, quite comprehensive. They are not a full paper by any means, and we wouldn't advise you to try and do that anyways.
Yeah, we have been. Sorry, I'm getting my charger. We have been kind of thinking about maybe like an essay kind of length, not for producing essays, but for like a longer kind of generation setting that uses kind of like an outline and then generate sequentially approach, but we haven't kind of done anything on that. I think if there are people who are facing this issue, they should email us, because I wouldn't expect it to be a problem because of the way we do truncation. So there might be a problem that you just need to like get in contact with me so we can fix that. I need to look into. Okay, so yeah, this is I like this question a lot, because then I get to sort of like educate people on the reality of detecting synthetic text. So yeah, the question is, on the topic of plagiarism tools, I have a classmate that copies and pastes directly from Cite Assistant. That would be misuse of Cite Assistant. The URLs gave them away. Anyway, how I've taken to pasting their work into sites like GPT-0 and Zero GPT, they both returned that their work is fully AI generated. It is actually known that it is impossible to detect synthetic text, and it will be impossible. There is no way to reliably detect AI generated text. There's a great paper on this called, trying to remember, called Paraphrasing Evades Detectors of AI Generated Text. But essentially, this isn't something that you should ever use a tool for relying on. Whether text is generated or not, it's not possible to detect. Is it possible to become a beta tester for you, get access to the next release you're working on, and offer feedback? So we actually deploy everything right away. So there's no kind of like release we haven't released yet. Like when I'm talking about things, they're like things that will be released tomorrow. Yeah. So if something's in progress, it will be released right away. Is there a possibility of getting a generated text in response a specific question using my imported references from Ovid or Web of Science, for example? Yes, there is. So essentially, if you have any list of references from any kind of tool, if you export the DOIs, you can create a dashboard on site with those DOIs. And then you in the assistant settings, or if you type the / command on Site Assistant, then you will be able to use only those DOIs for generating text from, essentially. Okay. In a threat, hold on, I'm just reading the questions. If I can ask something different. Yeah, I'm not sure what this question is getting at, Usab, but
I think this means like in the chat, if you're asking very different things, like does it need to all be related, or can you just, is it good to have multiple chats, or should you just have one chat with
yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, it's preferable to start a new chat for a new topic, because otherwise, like, it will work if you if you start a brand new topic in the same chat. The problem is, though, like I mentioned with retrieval augmented generation, is like the previous context could be misleading. And so you might run into problems. And the other thing is, like, now, again, like, because of our truncation strategies, you're kind of like losing information and the amount of references you can use as the chat goes on. So yeah, if it's a different topic, you should start a different chat for sure.
So we're running close to time. I'm trying to answer as many as we can. I don't know, Dom, if you want to scan through and answer any that seem particularly good.
Here. Yeah, so for training material, you should watch YouTube, our YouTube.
You don't have access to the full text from a publisher to use the abstract instead. Yes, in many cases, we are using abstracts where we don't have full text. David, we're happy to, collaborate and work on something that you're building. So if you're creating a large language model, yeah, let us know what you're building, and we can see how we can help.
Oh, can you consider functionality of uploading PDF articles? Yes, we are considering it. It is something we eventually do want to do. So the more people who ask for it, the higher priority it gets for us. Yeah, again, how can it be useful as a PhD student? You should watch our YouTube videos more on how to use Site Assistant. Is there a way to optimize our prompts to attain better response as common doing with ChatGPT? All of your prompt engineering responses or anything like that work with ChatGPT will also work with Site Assistant. It's the exact same approach you should use. Carol Cook, if you have thoughts about data sets that could help improve searching, we'd love to hear. Yeah, I think that pretty much gets at all of the questions. This was super fun. I hope it's useful.
So thanks, everyone. So we will be having more of these coming up at different time periods, so people can actually, listen in at different times. And this was just our first really kind of diving into Assistant. And so it seems like a lot of people want a bit more of a walkthrough on Assistant. And in future ones, I can do more of that so that we balance out kind of the technical aspects with like the useful aspects of the product. So we really appreciate all the questions and your time. we will post this recording and we'll share it with you. And as we've repeatedly said, please email us and let us know what is not working good for you. And again, that helps us prioritize and know, like, here's the struggles that people are dealing with. So thanks a lot to Dom, and thanks everyone for joining. And thanks for trying out Scite and subscribing to Scite if you're a subscriber. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.